All right, everyone, we're going to get started. We imagine a number of people are stuck still in the break, but they, for the people live streaming, as well as the lucky attendees in this audience, there is no question, you don't need a survey. This will be the most dynamic session in the entire Congress. So that is guaranteed, and we will have fun, and it is an intimate crowd. First, let me say, make some introductions, and we could just go down the table. So Meena, do you just want to give a brief?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Nice to see those of you who are here, and hello to everybody on the line. This is Meenakshi Datta. I co-lead Sidley Austin's healthcare practice area team and focus on regulatory and compliance counseling with pharma and medical device companies.
Rita?
Hi everyone, this is Rita. I'm a consultant with the ZS Risk and Compliance Practice, and I focus on strategic risk assessment, transparency reporting, and developing monitoring processes for business processes.
And I'm Michael Shaw. I head up our risk and compliance practice at ZS, and been in the industry for many years. As I was just sharing with Meena, I was at the first one of these when I was in the OIG back when, and I look forward to having an interactive dialogue, not just with the panel, but with all of you in the room and for those who continue to come in. We're here to talk about practical considerations for connecting telehealth with telehealth between patients and pharma companies actually connecting pharma companies connecting patients to telehealth offerings. And this is, I could tell you from, we haven't really discussed this, Meena, how hot it is in your practice group, but with respect to ZS, so many of our clients are getting into this space, and one of the benefits that Rita and I have in our risk and compliance practice, we don't just do straight compliance advisory, we help support our business colleagues with innovative business offerings, and one of those is not just digital connected health and a variety of other patient support services, but actually the area of telehealth. It is an incredibly hot area now, and there are also concerns about it because recently, if you guys are aware, and we're going to go over it, there was an OIG fraud alert about this. Our hope is to navigate the issues in this session, show you practical things to think about to help enable you and your organizations work in this space. Because at the end of the day, we want patients to improve their outcomes in a variety of ways. So telehealth, getting them to the right providers is one of the ways to do that. So I want to go over first, as I was just mentioning, we want to talk about the key objectives behind telehealth platforms. We then want to talk about compliance controls and strategies for pulling this through in your organization, practical considerations for the design of these platforms, key privacy considerations in telehealth offerings, and then generally key success factors based on what we've seen with our clients. But first, some disclaimers, and I know you guys hear this a lot, but these are our personal views. More importantly, none of us are giving you specific legal advice or technically compliance advice. We're giving you our opinions related to this area, and ultimately it's for you to navigate these with your respective compliance and legal organizations. That said, let's jump into it and get this party started, if you will. So the objectives. We've heard it actually, if you guys have been sitting in on the sessions as of yesterday, it comes up sometimes, but it doesn't come up enough when we talk about compliance with the patients being at the end of this thing. And the important piece that all of our organizations are trying to improve, make patients feel better, live longer, do more. And to do that, you need to have access to care, you need continuity of care, and you need adherence. So a number of the objectives in trying to get someone to a telehealth organization is we all, if you guys are part of a variety of companies, we know there's a lot of drop off there. We know that patients learn about their disease state, but then don't know how to get treatment for this particular disease state. And there are a number of ways that you could do this, in particular in the US, connecting with patients where you can't in some other countries, but it's all should be steeped in the objective of helping patients. And Meena, I don't know if you have anything to add in when you navigate with your clients.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, from a legal perspective, we're always focused on the question of what's the legitimate business purpose. That's one of the standards under the anti-kickback statute that we're looking to control risk against. And I think the way you've framed it up, Michael, is really important, that if the objective is an end, result that's positive for the patient, and we'll get into this, and your slides will do a great job with this, but there are a series of controls, right, that lead up to that step that hopefully unfolds in a positive result, positive experience, positive patient journey, adherence, and the like for the patient. And with so many of these telehealth types of arrangements that pharmaceutical and medical device companies consider, a lot of it is about getting the patient to an entry point even for care. And how do you facilitate an appropriate entry point for care, which then from there allows all the other steps to fall into place. And so telehealth is an important opportunity for patients, including Medicare, Medicaid, and other patients, to access care in the first instance, to even understand what the it is. And so, I would say I've seen a big shift, Rita and Michael, over the last 10 years, and everything that's old is new again. But it used to be that our clients, would really say, no go to these entry points for access to care. And then what happened? The pandemic happened, and we saw the importance of being open to access to care for patients in a variety of different settings. And importantly, the government saw the importance of that, and provided waivers for certain telehealth services and things like that. So I think there's more recognition from the OIG and other agencies about the policy reasons why these telehealth access points are important. And so therefore, there's an opportunity for life sciences companies that are also interested in that entry point for access to care or that ongoing care, to help support appropriate telehealth arrangements. Part of what we're going to talk about is, well, how do you assess whether something's appropriate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with respect to that shift, it is real. When I've been with ZS for 2 years now. Prior to that, I was a compliance officer at GSK, and then prior to that at Novartis. And in those discussions on the no-go, a whole variety of patient support services prior to the pandemic used to, really raise concerns of legal in our internal respective legal departments for right reasons. But you had the pandemic, which kind of showed that you can do these things, and not just telehealth, but say, for instance, the big thing was any kind of decentralized nurse education in someone's home. Oh my God, that's going to be white coat marketing. That's going to be unauthorized practice of medicine. But we've seen some of that happen. And to Meena's point, the government actually supports some of these patient support health services that before you could just see with a lens for fraud and abuse. But now it's about access to care. It's about continuity of care. It's about adherence. But if you and your organizations hear objectives where they say, hey, we want to connect people to telehealth because we just want to drive share, then that's the wrong objective. Obviously, our sales and marketing organizations have a job to do, but ultimately you should be thinking about what is the gap here, and is there an appropriate reason to be navigating these patients to telehealth?
One other thing I'll add is that sometimes we have to experience things for ourselves to understand that they're actually legitimate. And I do think that's part of what happened over the pandemic is, you've got government officials sort of all over the place who also themselves, I'm sure, accessed telehealth just like the rest of us did when we had to during the pandemic. And it now normalizes an activity that before was mystical. What is this telehealth stuff? It sounds like an end run around actually seeing your doctor and getting meaningful care. And I think that notion has been debunked to some extent. And hopefully that momentum will continue. There's always, we don't want to paint a totally rosy picture. Of course, there are these nefarious types of telehealth arrangements out there, and we'll talk a little bit about distinguishing and some of the things you want to put on your checklist. If your company is considering a telehealth arrangement, how do you sift what's the phrase, wheat from the chaff type of thing? How do you find the good partners, the legitimate partners, and incorporate that into your due diligence checklist for vetting a potential partner in a telehealth arrangement?
Yeah. So on the screen, there are a number of objectives. You won't go through all of these, but ultimately, getting prescription fulfillment should not just be seen as because it may lead to profit to any particular organization. It shouldn't just be seen as a criminal endeavor. It's getting someone who should legitimately have a medical necessity for a product, their prescription. So this is one of the ways to do that. And we're gonna get a little more practical as we move forward. But as these issues come up and as your organizations bring these up to you, there are a variety of kind of best practices, if you will. Some of these might be familiar to you just in your general experience, but also hearing in other sessions. Obviously, compliance wants to be seen as a partner. That's the ideal state in any organization. Have a seat at the table, get in early. But in particular, when it comes to telehealth, getting in early is so important because there are so many, and Rita's going to go over some of these considerations too, when you're doing design work. There are so many considerations from a tech standpoint on your hub, as we call it, a digital front door, that you're going to have to make choices early in the process. So to get comfortable with where the risks are, both compliance and privacy risk and perception risk, you should get in there early. There's also not just the technical capabilities, but user experience kind of thing. We don't want one of the solutions to your companies to be, oh yeah, it's 100% compliance, but it looks like crap and no one's going to use it. I mean, that's not going to help anyone. So you have some of these user experience, but it's really fascinating to try to balance all these objectives. Balance the user experience, balance the business objective, and balance the compliance one. And you could kind of only do that if you get in early and try to, connect the dots on all these things.
Yeah. And, as if you're working with a business partner who's proposing a telehealth arrangement, some of the most fundamental things that we look for in those types of arrangements, really one of the first questions you should ask with the arrangement is, what is the potential for medically unnecessary services as part of this arrangement? And if there is a potential for medically unnecessary services, what can we do to reduce or eliminate that risk if we move forward with this type of arrangement? Medical necessity is really the key area that has been emphasized in OIG's stated remarks about telehealth arrangements. And it makes sense. What they're worried about are patients receiving medically unnecessary services or care from prescribers or ordering physicians who have received, kickbacks as a result of a telehealth arrangement, and that could manifest as well with a pharma partnership with a telehealth company. So keeping that kind of North Star in mind, you know, look at your arrangement and try to figure out whether programmatically you think there are perverse incentives for medically unnecessary care. Sometimes there's not, and it can help take the temperature down on an arrangement. You feel better about it. Well, you know, why are there not? Why is that potential reduced? A good example is, let's say your drug is prescribed by a specialist of a particular kind. It's, you know, your on-label specialty is a niche medical specialty, but there is a genetic test, right, that might be helpful in patients understanding whether they're even predisposed for one particular type of treatment versus another. Well, oftentimes ordering physicians for laboratory tests are different than ordering physicians, or, you know, treating physicians for any particular terrible disease. And so when you can start to look at the design and programmatically understand, well, gosh, is there on paper a perverse incentive for over ordering the test, or do we think we've controlled for that risk? This is the kind of analysis as part of the design phase that you want to go through.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question there. Go ahead.
So I'm struggling with telehealth and the linkage to pharma. And what type of arrangement, besides just sort of general advertisement and things like that, I'm struggling with what type of arrangement could be appropriate when you link pharma to telehealth. Because to me, that's just more of a provider, patient-provider type of technology. I mean, have you seen
Yeah.
arrangements where
So we're going to get in, I'll answer the question right now, but we're going to get into the end-to-end process. But essentially, what we're saying is our pharma companies want to make sure education is out there in the right way. They want identified gaps in people's clinical care to be recognized, not just by doctors, but patients. And once those are recognized, they want to help get to the right physician or to get a prescription. Now, we're going to go through some of the controls to make sure it's not just necessarily driving someone to prescribe the product for that company. It's someone who's worried about a particular condition and wants to learn more, and the pharma company, through its website, which we refer to as a digital front door, can make that connection. But there are a variety of controls we're going to go over to make sure that it's done to respect privacy, respect independent clinical decision-making, respect fraud and abuse concerns.
So we're talking about the connection between the provider and the patient.
Well,
Making that connection.
Well, patient learns about information on a pharma company's website, maybe based on certain information, based on certain questions. We're going to go through the end-to-end. They learn, hey, this could concern me. This is a disease state I want to learn more about. I want to talk to a doctor. Here's how you could do it.
So the linkage between the pharmaceutical company and the
A
patient.
telehealth provider to get them to the right doctor.
I see.
And I'll give, yeah.
That facilitation, I was thinking more along the lines of the actual telehealth communication. So like the provider is providing treatment or a service directly to the patient.
It could be that way, yeah. I think it's
That's
both.
what-
I think it's
I
both,
was-
but it's what
okay.
Michael's describing, that digital front door. I love that phrase, by the way.
Yeah,
I hadn't heard
that's-
that. I like that.
That's a ZS.
I was going to say, you should trademark that, Michael. You know, it could be on a landing page or a web page of the pharma company's website, and there could be options for different telehealth providers if the patient is interested in learning more about potential care options. Again, there's lots of important controls we'll discuss. But just to kind of give two examples, one I've already given, that, you know, I think is an important one, and that is genetic testing, right? The pharma company doesn't make the test, somebody else makes or performs the test, but the test is a predicate to understanding whether you go left in your care pathway or whether you go right. and it's fundamental. And that's objective information. Sometimes it, probably more often than not with a rare disease, it's gonna tell you go left, which means this product is not right for you. It's not right for you. And so when we think about the OIG prudential factors and overutilization of a drug, if you've got a predicate service that steers the patient away from the drug, that is a positive factor when it's not appropriate for them. The other area we see these types of questions come up in quite a bit, not exclusively, is kind of behavioral health and therapy and things of that nature, where quite a few patients now look to get that type of service online, both for the confidentiality, the convenience, the privacy, all of those reasons. People are seeking behavioral health therapy more and more and more online, and it's becoming a more mainstream option. And so when you think about how that predicate service is a necessary step before any prescription of any product, that's another example, if that helps you visualize it.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
But let's walk through the end-to-end process and start talking about some of these relevant risks and potential ways to mitigate this risk. So Rita, do you want to take us through the
Yeah,
end-to-end?
so I think when we were thinking through some of the practical compliance considerations, we thought through the whole end-to-end process and the different options. So starting from the beginning, once the patient lands on the page, if they want to see if certain treatment types are applicable to them, they could take an initial medical assessment. And with that, we need to map out all of the questions and follow-ups and the different options that they could choose to see whether it's necessary for the pharma company to capture and store that data. So if so, we want to evaluate the data processing, storage, and security considerations and make sure to incorporate that on the back end, and whether any of the questions that are asked and their responses trigger any adverse event reporting considerations that we also need to take into account as well. So, yes.
And I would say even the questions, Rita, also need to be considered not just for adverse events, privacy considerations, but for promotional considerations. You don't want to be asking questions in a certain way that seems like you're directly promoting to a patient, so that kind of review comes in at that stage as well.
Yep, definitely. As part of the question internal review and approval, we want to make sure every piece of the content is true disease education and does not have any promotional intent. So that's the internal medical assessment piece. So after they've conducted that and they want to now navigate to a telemedicine vendor, whether it's Teladoc or other vendors, how should that page look in terms of the different options of the vendors they could choose? And once they select a vendor and navigate to another page, what are the considerations on boundary management that we need to consider, and making sure there's a disclaimer and pop-up to show you are leaving company X website and going into another website. And once you go into that website, would they need to re-log in, and making sure those considerations are set in place with the different vendors in play.
Everything Rita just said is so important. These operational steps are critical parts of the legal and compliance controls. And really the way, I think about these things is you're creating an information opportunity. It should never be coercive. It should never be any kind of bait and switch. That's why, Rita's explaining that when you go to the next website, like you're leaving this page, now you're going to this page. You want to avoid these kinds of traps that could have the appearance, in hindsight, of deceptive trade practices. That's essentially what you're guarding against. And also transparency to the patient. Again, it's an information opportunity. Part of that information includes, access to care through telehealth. And the patient can choose to go through that door, or they might choose not to go through that door and continue navigating your company's website for other information they may want to see. So it ultimately is the patient's choice, and it needs to be an objective, and to borrow from the ad prom world, sort of a fair and balanced choice that you're presenting to the patient. And when they get to their provider, if they decide to click through and go forward to a telehealth provider, it should really be very decoupled in actuality as well as in appearance from that provider's service. Their medical care should be decoupled in actuality and in appearance from the pharma company's business operations. That is the doctor or healthcare provider and patient relationship, and the sanctity of that and that objective advice, that's part of what you would want to sound check for, that we have not disrupted that relationship.
Yeah. And so far, just if you're keeping track at home, we've covered, independence of clinical decision-making, privacy considerations, promotional risks, adverse event risks, but also, and we'll get into this a little bit when we talk about the OIG fraud alert, the relationship you have with that telehealth provider that you're sending for this independent assessment. Obviously, you wouldn't want to have some contractual incentive for them to just prescribe your product. There should be nothing structurally that influences them either directly or indirectly to just put, this referral's coming in from XYZ pharma company, we got to prescribe their product. You got to think about those situations and try to make absolutely clear, even in contract language, that is not the intent. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the OIG fraud alert. But just wanted to add on those different risks that this is an area of a lot of risk, but it's an important area to navigate for patients and for patient benefit. So, Rita, do you want to continue on and to end? Or?
Yeah, so I think some other options that we consider as well was if a patient indicates that they already have a prescription and just wants additional resources, that's one path that might not trigger as many privacy considerations, whereas if they say that they want to potentially speak with a nurse on any questions they have, that might trigger additional privacy considerations on consent management that we would need to make sure there's configurations for that workflow on the back end.
And Rita brings up the nurse issue, which adds on for people keeping track on the different risks here. People call this role different things in different companies. You hear nurse navigator, et cetera, when the patient has questions before going down that end to end. What you want to be cautious of, and which is a big bugaboo for us every time we hear it, you shouldn't name this role a concierge. I mean, because to me, I can't even tell you how many companies I've heard say it, it shouldn't be seen as a concierge for a variety of reasons. One, it's truly a navigator to try to have this continuity of care and attention to the patient. But obviously from a kickback standpoint, concierge has connotations of white glove service, extra value added, things that they are doing that is otherwise the responsibility of someone else, either the patient or HCP. So this should be a navigator. That navigator has to be trained, because another risk in the whole laundry list of risks is unauthorized practice of medicine. You don't want that nurse to be acting as a healthcare provider for that patient. So they have to be trained, scripted, understand certain controls when adverse events come up, things like that. But that is another core piece in the end-to-end that we see.
I love that point. Yeah, we hate that word, concierge, because it connotes convenience, luxury. I mean, how many of us have concierges in our day-to-day lives? We don't, because we don't pay for it. So, likewise, kind of giving that patient that feeling of a golden experience, not a good, and so, we have to tamp those kinds of marketing phrases down in the business. And, sometimes we get the question of, well, gosh, they've been calling it this in their business plans. Can we unring the bell? I think you can. I think there are ways to take appropriate steps to retrain and redirect proposals that have gained steam internally, but in order to move forward, are going to have to be refashioned with appropriate verbiage, because the words do matter. And externally, I think navigator is a great phrase for this type of activity if it fits the bill. Internally, you're going to want to look at this in addition to everything else we're going to talk about, or that we're talking about. You also want to look at it through the lens of product support. Can we credibly look at the activity through the lens of product support and defend it? Is it reasonably tied enough to our product, which in the sense that it's in that disease state, but also doesn't tip, cross the line over into leading a provider to, automatically prescribe our product? Of course, that would be inappropriate. That would get to the medical necessity issue. But is it tied closely enough to the disease state that if we had to defend it, part of what we would say to OIG and DOJ would be that this is supportable. The regulatory path forward on this was a product support path, and it scores well, meaning it has low risk under the prudential factors. Yeah.
So how do you balance that risk? You are trying to make a determination that's closer to the decision making versus having that nexus closer to the product. Right? So if it's too narrowly tailored, just the support service or the testing that you were mentioning earlier, you don't want it to be broad for consideration for utilization, but then you have the risk of if it's too narrowly tailored, it's an access to your product.
Yeah, and so, it's very fact dependent. One factor that can help in that analysis is if there are competitor products, and it's, also what is essential as part of this are your contractual reps and warranties, if any, with the telehealth provider. For some of these arrangements, there is no arrangement, there's no contract between the pharma company and the telehealth provider, none. Because we're just posting links to telehealth providers that have national, reach, and any patient can click and then they're off and running to get their care. For others of these, there is a contractual relationship between the pharmaceutical company and the telehealth provider for the provision of, being available, and it's very, very fact dependent. But when that occurs, the contract between the telehealth provider and the pharma company really needs to underscore that the telehealth provider has complete and utter medical independence, and it is their obligation to exercise that independent judgment in whatever care they provide to the patient. And they have to rep and warrant to it. And, it can't just be lip service. It has to actually be true. So we can't be taking steps on the pharmaceutical side to undermine their independent judgment. Now, part of the way you can decouple that, and this relates to Rita's next slide, is, patient privacy. And to what extent we get data back, if any, from the telehealth provider. And I am very, I think we have to be very careful with any patient data because it raises the specter of patient tracking, and you want to avoid that. So limiting the data reporting back, if any at all. If you have no data reporting back from the telehealth provider, that will be relatively lower risk than getting aggregate data. And I can't imagine a scenario where you're getting more than aggregate, or more granular than aggregate.
Though I will say, because we're focused on the telehealth piece,
Yeah.
we could probably have a whole session on navigating risks of sharing data between
Yeah.
entities, pharma companies, organized customers, et cetera. So I would leave it at that
Yeah.
for now, for this purposes, that the more you uncouple it and don't have that kind of data feed, that certainly limits the risk. While we're adding on to the litany of risks that you need to navigate here, Meena talked about this third party. So we in compliance, no third party risk, right? If you are getting a partner here, you want to evaluate that with due diligence. You don't want, as Meena said, someone to just give you lip service, say, yeah, we get it, whatever. You want to make sure that those third-party telehealth organizations understand the risk, train their people appropriately, and I tell you from evaluating some of these entities, you know it when you see it. You know when someone's very conscientious. We've seen entities that actually provide a heck of a lot of considerations at times, like it adds to our repertoire for things to think about. You see other companies who just want the business and don't really care. So third-party risk is certainly something important. You want to make sure you have a reputable third party. Yeah.
How do the telehealth doctors and the telehealth companies get compensated in a way that doesn't violate the AKS? Are they charging the patient for the visit? Are they billing the patient's insurance company? Or is the pharma company somehow indirectly paying for the visit?
No, the pharma company, to my knowledge, isn't paying for anything in that regard. They're just facilitating to a telehealth organization that charges a normal way they would find someone on the street or in the virtual street. So that telehealth company is, they're paying their doctors as per visit, normal visit. The points we're making about kickback is there should be no extra incentive for them to be driving business to the pharma company that happens to serve the digital front door to get them there. One of the other ways to do this, which we really haven't talked about, is, and I've seen this both ways, and we talked about this before, Meena, optionality. To me, in the kickback world, the more you give people options, so you're connecting with a telehealth organization that could, like, I don't want to name names because I don't want to drive business to any particular company, but some have a network of doctors, that they're just merely a network of doctors, so it's not like they're even employed by one organization. That's optionality. They don't have any necessarily commitment or obligation to that organization. Other companies, at least one company that I saw, I talked with the chief compliance officer, and they drove it to just one company that had a set of docs because they wanted to do the due diligence on this organization and trust to know that it's going to the right entity with the right training and all of those people are more trusted. But that's a risk balancing that you guys have to do. Personally, I'm an optionality type of guy.
And just to add to that a little bit, where I see some of this sprouting up is where the telehealth service itself is non-reimbursable. It doesn't mean it has to be, but it takes the risk down, right? Because there's really no risk of submitting to any insurer. It's cash out of pocket. That can be one element to look at. It's not always that way, for some of these. And if we were doing a 2.0 version of this, I mean, a lot of this comes up with laboratory tests, and you'll, want to cross-check if you're looking at any kind of telehealth arrangement that involves a lab order. For those of us who've been in the industry a long time, laboratory fraud is the original, right, Michael? It's the original OIG,
Scam.
Lab scam.
1998, I think. Or 5. No,
right.
1995.
It was the original, kind of area of fraud that OIG focused on. They've always hated lab fraud, always. And so with genetic testing, it was at the end of last year, OIG issued a report saying that their costs, that Medicare's costs had skyrocketed with 4 types of genetic laboratory tests. I would look at those tests, and ask, was this one of my tests or not? And just, so I think getting, it's all very fact dependent, but I think you're hearing that from Michael and Rita and from me that, we're seeing a pretty broad landscape of arrangements.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And I'm going to move through this slide quickly so we could get to the OIG fraud alert that came out. But this is, again, on our list of things, privacy. You heard Rita mention it before about the necessary data you need to help facilitate this process. That should be a good privacy practice anyway. You only want to collect the data you need. You want to anonymize data, as Meena said. There could be some data that could be considered PHI. There are privacy notices that you may have to do throughout this process. In particular, there are a number of state law privacy stuff. During this conference, I've been seeing a lot of updates on Colorado privacy law. I haven't even gotten into the depth of that one, but we certainly know California and Virginia need special privacy notices and consents. There's also the physical security of this data, that other than privacy, there's the security piece too, that if you're capturing certain things, you need to maintain it in an ethical and comprehensive way. Now, the last slide we'll get to, or the last main slide, I know we're running out of time, is this fraud alert that recently came out from the OIG. So I'll just share it this way. You know, Rita and I had been doing a number of projects in this realm of navigating where, and Meena too, but I hadn't talked to you about it, where we had been doing a number of projects in this realm where we've been navigating all the nuanced risks that we just talked through over the last, 40 some odd minutes. And then lo and behold, the OIG fraud alert comes out, and I used to be in the OIG, and I still love the folks in the OIG. But if you just read the headlines, it looks like telehealth fraud, scary, scary, stay away kind of thing. And I'm not criticizing them for that. I just wanted us to get out in this forum that if you read that fraud alert, a number of the things that are on the screen were in play for the providers involved that they were scrutinizing, and they run counter to all the things that we talked about today. There was actual kickback arrangements to generate more services. There were things of value that they were criticizing, going to the telehealth organization to have incentives to prescribe as much as possible. There was also, marketing tactics involved to try to aggressively increase the market, which led to the overutilization that Meena talked about. There was also, in general, medical unnecessary services going on. So it was questionable whether these services were even necessary for these patients. I think in particular, some of the cases they highlighted were in the behavioral health or mental health.
And diabetes as well.
And diabetes too. So there were a number of things that, again, run counter to the controls we talk about, which are all things that should help facilitate your thoughts in trying to navigate this and put in good controls to make sure these things don't happen. But it doesn't mean you can't navigate and connect people for the right reasons to telehealth in a compliant way. So we did want to get across that notion.
Yeah, and I mean, the risks, do get very tailored to like what the it is. So I think one of the biggest bees in the government's bonnet and watchdog media are these fly-by-night specialty pharmacies, the concierge pharmacies that dispense the creams and the this, that, and the other, where people want more confidentiality. They don't want to go to a pharmacy counter, even at their local, and they just want to be able to get their, that's part of what OIG calls telehealth, the online pharmacies. So if we're not doing that, that's helpful. They, as I mentioned, are also concerned about fraudulent laboratory test orders, medically unnecessary lab tests. They're also worried about taking advantage of vulnerable patients who are seeking mental health services, right, online. So being aware of those risk factors, those practical risk factors, and if you're arranging, especially in specialty pharma, many of the arrangements that are considered are just so far away from the types of things that I just mentioned, right? There are well-designed controls that can come into place, if they're rare diseases where there's a definitive diagnosis, either you have it or you don't, all of those things can kind of help take the risk down. And so, there are these ways forward. I'll just add that in addition to the special fraud alert, just recently in the last few weeks, OIG sort of listed its top 7 risk factors: double billing, medical necessity, So if you go to the OIG's webpage and you find the special fraud alert, you'll see some other resources on there that are quick reference guides for the things that they hate about telehealth arrangements. And if you can look at that and again, pressure test the proposal that's being put in front of you against those risk factors, and you score, what I like to say, score well on that. All these factors are not weighted equally, but if you're like, no, we don't, we have controls for this, we have controls for that, then you may be able to get to a place where you're comfortable. It's a reasonable risk profile to move forward with the arrangement. And that's what we're seeing in the marketplace. Yeah.
And that's where we could end on the last slide, just quickly, just what Meena said. Well, you want cross-functional engagement, so everyone's understanding how you're going to design things, strategic requirements gathering to understand what's essential, what's nice to have. We know the business loves to have their nice to haves. And then consistent stakeholder engagement throughout the implementation process. And then finally, pilot things and see how they're working. And then get proof of concept. Similar to the pandemic being a pilot of its own, there's nothing better to get your compliance and legal folks comfortable with something when you do a small pilot and it works effectively and the sky doesn't fall, kind of thing. So we'll end on that. You guys have been very engaged. Thank you for the questions. We'll be up here. We're at time, but we'll be up here if anyone has any additional questions. But hopefully this was helpful for everyone.